Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Beyond Borders event entitled Storm in the Desert, which will take a look at the story of Britain's intervention in Libya and the Arab Spring. My name is David Pratt. I'm Foreign Affairs Editor with the Herald and Sunday Herald. And it's my great pleasure to be chairing this event. I was here last year, and it's a fantastic festival. It's always a bit dreich, mind you. I'd like to see the weather a wee bit better, but nevertheless, we make the most of it. Joining me this morning to discuss Libya and said subject are two, frankly, colleagues and friends of mine. And certainly on my left, Mark Muller Stuart is I think, a fairly well-kent face around here, being obviously the founder of the Beyond Borders Festival itself. But for those of you unfamiliar with Mark, he is a sort of leading advocate specialising in human rights and public international law, and he advises international bodies on humanitarian issues such as conflict resolution and human rights. He's a senior mediating advisor to the United Nations Department of Political Affairs. And he has conducted international missions throughout the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, and written a number of books somewhere along the way. I personally like to think of him as a kind of Indiana Jones of human rights and international law, and that's perhaps the best way I can describe him. No less exotic and dramatic on my right is Stephen Gethins, who's SNP MP for North East Fife. And as you may know, Stephen is no stranger to close-run things either. Shall we mention the majority?
You can fire away.
You can look it up later. In 2015, he was appointed to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, its first SNP member. And he's also worked in the NGO sector over a number of years prior to being involved in the horrendous corridors of power that is Westminster. During that time, he worked in peace building, arms control, and a variety of other areas. He's now international spokesperson for international affairs for the SNP. So what I'd like to do this morning is just begin by obviously having a little bit of a look at Libya today. Where are we today? Because it is a rather complicated situation, to put it mildly. And one of the things that I know Stephen's been heavily involved in on the Foreign Affairs Select Committee was producing quite an extensive report. But I'd like to just begin by asking Stephen to give us a little bit of an outline of where are we at with Libya today, Stephen? What's the political backdrop and context?
Yeah, well, I suppose the nice thing about being a politician, which is regardless of your majority, which I like to consider as efficiency rather than anything else, is I suppose you can have a look at things and you're not answerable for to anybody else but how you describe it. And I think that's helpful with Libya, because Libya at the moment, I describe the situation as being a bit of a mess. We're now 6 years on from intervention. Let's not forget this was an intervention that came in the aftermath of Iraq and Afghanistan, when we were supposed to have learned an awful lot of the lessons of those conflicts. I think it's fair to say that Libya could be described as a failed state. Not just a failed state, but a failed state on Europe's borders, with the consequential problems, not just for the people of Libya, but also for Europe as well. It's become a proxy, I think, for other conflicts. The situation today is that the Government of National Accord, backed by the United Nations and EU, I think we could generously say it's in control of about a third of the territory. General Haftar and the other parliament in Tobruk has 2/3 of the territory, with countries like Russia and Egypt lining up behind General Haftar, and the EU, Turkey, Qatar lining up behind the Government of National Accord. And of course, this has a very significant impact on domestic politics as well, which is the main driver, I'm afraid to say, for governments, given the refugee and migration crisis that's affecting all parts of Europe, but certainly isn't helped by having, if you like, an open door at Europe's underbelly. So I think that's the situation at the moment. It's not a terribly good one, but I think what makes it worse from my perspective is the fact that this intervention, although 6 years ago, came long after our interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan.
I think one of the things that, I mean, I personally was also in Libya at the time of the revolution and was following the Arab Spring uprisings generally from Egypt and Tunis and subsequently obviously in Libya and Syria. And, you know, I remember being in Benghazi and subsequently Tripoli at the time and thinking, wow, you know, what a remarkable opportunity this might be for a new start for the country itself. So, you know, it's a depressing scenario to find that it is in such a mess at this particular point in time. But talking about the Arab Spring and its origins and how we got to where we are, I'd like now to turn to Mark and maybe say a little bit about the Arab Spring itself. Mark, I mean, why did you go there? Why were you involved in that time in the capacity that you were?
Well, I mean, I remember being in India, I think it was on the 25th of January 2011, at some highfalutin legal conference, and turning on the television and seeing the scenes from Tahrir Square, which were quite extraordinary. And what was really extraordinary about them was that the protests weren't directed towards the West, they weren't directed towards America, they weren't directed towards Israel, they weren't about the war on terror. They were about ordinary people demanding change. What they wanted was responsive government, what they wanted was an end to corruption. Above all, what they wanted was respect for some form of human dignity. I mean, all of this started off as a consequence of a Tunisian fruit seller who burnt himself to death in protest against the government officials taking away his fruit stand because he didn't have a license, but behind all of that, because he didn't pay the bribe. Now, that was probably an unremarkable event 10 years before, but because of the advent of social media, because Arabs could begin to share their experiences of unresponsive, corrupt government, unrepresentative government, millions of people began to hear about this story because his nephew uploaded it up onto the internet, and then suddenly you began to see these conversations multiply, and in the end, the result was Tahrir Square. So I was absolutely fascinated by this particular development, and in particular in Libya. The reason why I became even more fascinated by Libya was because the revolution really began with a number of lawyers and judges taking to the streets of Benghazi. 3 years before, I had been part of an international coalition of lawyers and the United Nations Special Rapporteur protecting lawyers in Pakistan, and suddenly something similar began to emerge. And we looked at their statements of the Transitional National Council, and there was a whole series of statements about commitments to the rule of law, and it was within that context that I began to sit there and think about how the Bar Council, I was the chair of the Bar Human Rights Committee then, how the Bar Council might get involved.
So, I mean, in the book itself, you outline specifically the reasons for going there. Can you just summarise those reasons specifically for going into Libya? Because it was a pretty hazardous undertaking, to put it mildly, at that time.
Well, we were concerned, first and foremost, to try and help lawyers rebuild the rule of law in Syria, in Libya. I got a telephone call from a solicitor friend of mine, Jason McHugh, and he had been representing IRA Semtex victims and Lockerbie victims. And for 20 years had harried the Gaddafi regime to try and get compensation for those victims. Now, as it happened, George Bush had managed to effect a £1.8 billion agreement for victims of terror from Gaddafi for US victims. But
that took him back to Benghazi instantly. It certainly took me back to Benghazi, that's for sure.
Thank you, Dave. Can you hear me? And so actually he suggested that perhaps the Bar Human Rights Committee might want to come to Benghazi with him because he was making the journey. as a consequence of the Brits not seeking compensation for IRA victims and Lockerbie, what happened was there was a great campaign against both Blair and then Brown, who set up the Northern Irish Reconciliation and Libyan Reconciliation Unit in the FCO. So we spoke to them, and I had a dialogue with them and said, look, there are these legacy issues. There's a team going out with Jason McHugh. He's part of your reconciliation unit. The Bar Council is interested because of some of these issues. And we had a personal message from David Cameron, who said he was very, very supportive of everything that Jason was doing, and he was committed to supporting this project. And so we decided that we would go to Libya and seek to negotiate with the Transitional National Council about Lockerbie, about IRA Semtex, but also to see whether or not we could build a concordat around the rule of law. And that was partly because of our other relations with other organisations who were involved in the Arab Spring and the civil society dimension of it.
I mean, it was a phenomenally turbulent time in Benghazi at that moment. I mean, I remember it well. And it's strange to think of the sort of parallels that were occurring in terms of UK politics at the time, Stephen. I mean, what was the atmosphere, if you like, back home with regards to what was unfolding in Libya?
What was interesting, and it's something that you mentioned, David, earlier on, was talking about this new approach, this fresh approach that we could really do something here and build on the mistakes of the past. And I was looking back through the records, and the vote in the House of Commons in favour of military action in Libya was something like 580, 590 to 12. And even my own party, which in the past had been very reluctant to back any kind of military action, backed it as well. And the dozen who backed it were people who historically would just not back any kind of military action. So there was, I think it's fair to say, and I think this is where everybody has to, there's a bit of a mea culpa across the political spectrum, but also beyond that as well, that this was something that was heavily backed. Saying that, and this is something that came to the production of the report, unlike Mark's book is not available in all good bookshops, but is available online free. This is something that what happened then was, because there was such overwhelming support for military action, back in the heady, distant days of 2015, just after the 2015 election, when David Cameron was Prime Minister, and we thought we had a good 5 years, there was a view on the Foreign Affairs Committee that I sat on, was to let's really get our teeth into what happened in Libya. Let's really get our teeth into the mistakes that were made, because one of the mistakes, obviously, that was made and why Obama was so heavily critical was that there was a feeling that this was something that the Europeans owned, in particular France and the United Kingdom, that this was not a decision that had been taken lightly to make for military intervention. But what was very striking to me, in spite of the support, in spite of the political, if you like, consensus around the intervention, where we are 6 years on, was that some of the basic mistakes that were made, and some of them that we teased out as a result of our evidence taking, were quite striking. Some really quite basic mistakes, that we were relying on militias. I mean, this is a UK government, France relying on militias, that nobody had thought about what would happen if there's a vacuum and Islamic militias or try and fill those gaps as well. So I think that at the time, the political atmosphere was one of, let's do that. But actually, I think what's happened is we're making the same mistakes, and government was as ill prepared for the Libya conflict as it had been for other conflicts.
I do remember at the time there was a tremendous. I mean, when I spoke to people subsequently, you know, there were people still smarting from the Iraq experience and the whole notions of foreign adventures and military campaigns and intervention, and were very, very apprehensive about becoming involved in Libya. On the ground in Benghazi, of course, meeting some of the people directly involved in the revolution, they were desperately keen for every method of support they could get, militarily, air support, political support, or whatever, Mark. Yeah?
I mean, I think one of the reasons why I wrote the book in the end was because today we look at Libya and it's seen as a lawless place, a place of Islamic fundamentalism, chaos, an incubator for jihadist terrorism. Well, the reality is when I got there,
Absolutely.
it was literally full of people like you and me across Benghazi. It was lawyers, dentists, students. In fact, the first image I saw when I got to the outskirts of Benghazi, and this was right in the heart of the revolution, was of a Boy Scout in pristine condition, literally directing the traffic with little Arab men waiting patiently for the signal to move forward. And this was because, in fact, this was the only organization, structured organization, that was left after Gaddafi had fallen. But what was interesting was that when we ventured into Benghazi, what we found was not just all the lawyers in the courthouse trying to set up a sort of a mini little state with the sort of organizations of governance, but the most remarkable sort of flowering of artistic achievement. There was a whole building dedicated
It was a grand house, wasn't there? A huge building in
to graffiti.
Yeah.
There was another one to the production of various testimonies and social medias. Another one was full of Arab rap artists who were sort of developing music which was going on to radio stations for the first time across Libya. So it rather reminded me of, I happened to be in Czechoslovakia in 1989. It rather reminded me of that. So what I experienced back then was the kind of optimism of the Arab Spring, and what these people wanted was a state that was built upon the rule of law and everything I said beforehand. Why that failed to materialize is a massive question, not simply for the Libyans, but I think for the British government. I supported Cameron's intervention, the humanitarian intervention into Libya. I think it just about was justified under the 6 principles of the principle of responsibility to protect. He did manage to get a UN resolution that actually authorized the use of force, or at least an air zone. And so I have no doubt whatsoever, and I think William Hague is correct to say that you could not have taken the risk of allowing Gaddafi to reach Benghazi. There would have been a humanitarian catastrophe. The real issue is what happened once you had actually secured Benghazi, and there was then a change of direction towards regime change. The real question, I think, for the Brits then was, well, what sort of support did you then have to provide in order to ensure that there was a proper political transition? And that's where I think we failed.
I'll come back to that in a moment, but just to reiterate, I think it's very difficult, isn't it, to describe the sort of the optimism, the sheer enthusiasm and energy of particularly young revolutionaries in Benghazi at that time. I mean, in terms of sort of cameo snapshots, I was constantly reminded, I spent a bit of time in my early days in Central America, and I had all these sort of hallmarks. I mean, I hate to use the word sort of romanticized notion of revolution, but people were dressing like revolutionaries, and there was a lot of Che Guevara berries around, and, you know, and scarves and ties, and you know, the paraphernalia and trappings of it. You know, there was a fantastic, perhaps some might say a naive enthusiasm and optimism, and it was watching that optimism being stifled, I think, that subsequently. Where did that begin to go wrong? Is there a point, do you think, where, I mean, Stephen, is there a point where do you think we began to lose control of political influence over events in Libya?
From our findings were that we found that loss of control happened pretty much immediately. What happened was there was one statistic that I dug up, sort of early stages of my time as a member of Parliament, which was I asked the House Commons Library for some research on how much we spent on military intervention and how much we spent on reconstruction, and it struck me that we spent, for every £13 that we spent bombing Libya, we spent £1 on reconstruction. efforts afterwards. Now, those figures, to be fair, have been slightly changed since, but they're still not that far off of it.
And it's an age-old lesson.
And it is an age-old lesson.
There are precedents.
And I remember speaking to ministers, and obviously, you know, in the time of politics, and I raise Libyan Prime Minister's questions, but people speak to each other behind the scenes, and you try your best to speak to colleagues in other political parties. And I spoke to one of the ministers about this privately, and I said, why did this happen? And he went, well, what we found was that we couldn't spend money there because there was nothing to spend money on, because we did not have anything institutional. We had no institutional organisations with which to cooperate. Because if you had that collapse, you can't give, you know, £500 million to the Boy Scouts to rebuild the country. So I think the mistakes were felt almost immediately. And Liam Fox recognised he had 4 questions. The first one was, should we do this? The answer was yes. Second one was sort of, who do we work with? What's the end point? But actually, they made the mistake of answering the first question without answering the subsequent questions before intervention. So almost immediately.
Who should we have been speaking to, Mark, in your
Well,
opinion? Who did we not speak to? Should have
We met the Transitional National Council leadership. In the end, we managed to secure an agreement on Lockerbie for compensation and in relation to IRA Semtex. And actually, Abdul Jalil also provided a statement in respect of Gaddafi and the Lockerbie incident. But we also developed a concordat on rule of law matters, which the FCO had indicated before we left were likely to support. That's why we went. Actually, when I came back, I had a meeting in the cabinet Cobra room with Jonathan Powell, with all the top leadership of the FCO and other British officials concerning Libya. And we set out some of the problems. We turned around and said, well, the Transitional Council, which you are supporting and which you are sending your stabilisation officers into to support, one MI6 official turned around and said, it's there, it exists, but it's not connected to anything. And so the real question was, how do you support what they were trying to do? The reality is the British government took a different view about how this conflict was going to end. Jonathan Powell and myself turned around and said, look, there are emerging fissures within the revolutionary camps. One, the kind of lawyers that we were talking about, committed to a rule of law, a democratic state, and then a series of other Islamicist groups, partly committed to some of those objectives, but plainly at odds with this other group. And they consisted of the Muslim Brotherhood and various other Islamicist elements. And we said you need to initiate an inter-militia dialogue about fundamental issues to do with the rule of law before the conflict ends, so that issues to do with what happens if Gaddafi is captured, his sons are captured, the treatment of other elements, there is an agreement, and more particularly over political transition. The British government took the view that at the end of the day, Tripoli was going to fall by internal defection. They took the view that actually Tripoli was not going to be taken by rival militias, and therefore their stabilisation plan literally was directed towards that objective, and there was never a plan B. And we were always saying to them, you're not there on the ground, and the realities are that there are different fissures here, and if anything, the Islamicists are winning in terms of their prowess on the military field, and are certainly better organised in terms of planning for an eventual liberation of Tripoli. And so, to my mind, I read your report, and many of the government ministers like to suggest that it was not a question of planning, it was just simply, at the end of the day, that they didn't have the opportunity to... the reality is far from that. I think there was a failure of policy. If you're going to intervene, if you're going to move from a humanitarian position to some form of regime change, then you have got to begin to think about how you're going to support a political transition. And in a place like Libya, you need to do that before the conflict, and they had 6 months to do it.
I do remember actually in Tripoli when Gaddafi was overthrown, just how rapidly the situation changed, and how obvious it was that Islamist groups were coming to the fore. It was such a rapid transformation. The people I referred to earlier, the revolutionaries that perhaps would have contributed to some very solid building of the country, was suddenly pushed aside, and this vacuum was filled by these other people. Which brings us back to I suppose, the mess that Libya is in today. Where are we today in terms of? I mean, it's become as you say, a bit of a failed state.
Yep.
It's certainly become a place where a lot of members of Daesh or IS are now leaving Mosul and other areas and making their way to Yemen and to Libya.
Yep.
So, it's become a new hub for that.
It has, and one thing that was striking, I want to talk about where we are now, because I think there could possibly be an opportunity. But one thing that was striking, I don't know if anybody remembers, but the lack of intelligence that was going on. I don't know who remembers William Hague standing outside and telling the world that Colonel Gaddafi had gone off to Venezuela. Which I think demonstrates, and for a foreign secretary to come out, and foreign secretaries don't just come out and say these things off the top of their head, especially somebody as able and thoughtful as William Hague clearly is, to come out and talk about that he got on a plane off to Venezuela. So I think that was striking. In terms of where things are now, I think if in terms of where we are in the Europe debate at the moment, I would like to see for the UK to say, well, look, this is a European problem. It is a European problem. This is just a few miles away. You have Royal Navy ships who are patrolling the routes. The refugee crisis, which is going through, part of which is being exploited by the failed state in Libya, is having a direct impact, yes, on Malta and Italy, but by consequence has an impact on us as well, whether we like it or not. So where we are now is that it was good to see that Boris Johnson was in Libya this week. I was pleased that he's taken this on board, and I look forward to.
I'm sure the Libyans were pleased to see.
I'm sure the Libyans were delighted, even if they do have to practice the national anthem a little bit. But look, I think that in a sense, with one of my views is that if you broke it, you fix it. And France and the United Kingdom have a particular responsibility to Libya. And I think it was striking President Obama's comments. In fact, President Obama's comments when he was president of a sitting prime minister, it was quite striking that you had critical comments of the way that the French and the British had dropped the ball on Libya. But we are where we are now. And I think that one thing, and I'm a little bit, one other thing that's reflective is when we were asked to approve military action in Syria, my committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, managed to hold up parliamentary approval of that because there was much more nervousness, even amongst the Conservative Party, who feel that they, and in fairness to the chairman of our committee, we had this report, and remember, this wasn't just me approving this report, it was done on a cross-party basis, heavily critical of their own party, because I think the Tories felt that, well, we own this. We own this disaster in a way that we don't own the other ones. And I think we have a responsibility to step up to the plate. Libya is a failed state. It is having an impact on it. And I'm afraid that we will have to spend money on it. Now, there is a thought, and as a final point, when we went to North Africa as part of our inquiry, we were sitting down with UK military personnel and UK diplomatic personnel. There was a plan to land several thousand troops in Tripoli, now to train militias. Now, nothing had gone into the thinking of who they were training, where they were going to land, given that dignitaries couldn't even land, never mind 7,000 troops from the UK, France, Spain and elsewhere. But a lot of these plans were actually quite well advanced and are referenced in our reports. So that willingness to maybe make the same mistakes all over again, but I'm afraid we're in this for the long. If we're going to get this right, we're in it for the long term. It's going to cost us a lot of money, and it's going to cost a lot of political capital as well.
Thanks, Stephen. Mark, I'm conscious of time, and I'm keen to take some questions from the audience. But briefly, can I just number one? Is it fixable? Is Libya fixable now? I mean, Stephen was saying, it's broke. Well, the responsibility to fix it. Is it fixable?
There's a new opportunity. I mean, it's extremely difficult, but actually we do have a new UN special envoy, and there is a window of opportunity. One of the tragedies, I think, about what happened is that Libya wasn't a hothouse, actually, of jihadist fundamentalism at that stage. And in actual fact, it didn't have any of the fissures that you associate with Iraq, right? It wasn't a big Sunni-Shia divide whatsoever. It was a country that had enormous potential and resources. It could pay for itself. The problem was that for 42 years it was ruled by Gaddafi, and therefore it didn't have any governance institutions. All of this was known. Dominic Asquith now, towards your committee, has clearly conceded that there was an intelligence-light decision. But what do I think? I mean, I think at the end of the day, if you're going to try and address some of these problems, you need a patient, long-term approach. Mm-hmm. I think President Obama was right when he made his Cairo speech to suggest that if you are going to take advantage of, if you like, the Arab Spring, then you needed some sort of Marshall Plan. And my view is that at the end of the day, we can pretend to look the other way, but the same demands that animated the Arab Spring will come back. We have so many young people across the Middle East. They want jobs. They want an opportunity to better themselves. They want responsive government. We can have all the repression you want, but it will come back and hit us again. And we're going to have to then sort out a new type of policy. And the policy, I think, is one of engagement. And the other thing I want to turn around and say is that both whether it's in relation to Syria or whether it's in relation to Libya, the most extraordinary flowering happened in terms of civil society. There were many groups there, many fledgling organizations that wanted buy-in to a political transition process, and we didn't give them a voice or a platform. But I still think it is possible to begin to build those type of coalitions. But we've got to be in there for the long term, and we've got to be clear about what we're doing. General Richards said, you know, the diplomats just cross their fingers and hope that it will all come all right on the night simply because Libya had some resources and potentially some money to pay for transition. It takes a hell of a lot more than that. And I think if we're serious about human security and serious about our own security, then we need a much more intelligent response. I mean, I rather hope that when Boris went along there to lecture them about the failures of our Prime Minister in calling an election, that was code for having read The Storm in the Desert and realised that you need security before you have elections, and we should have had rule of law and security as the main focus after Gaddafi fell.
I think one of the great tragedies, anyone who's experienced or been on the ground, particularly during the Arab Spring, whatever country, is that, you know, you look at it now, you look at the consequences, be it in Syria, Iraq, or Libya, and everything seems so negative, everything seems so chaotic and destructive, and it is. And the terrible thing is that so many reasonable and reasoned voices have been marginalised and pushed aside in this chaos and the sort of extremism that's come through. But I want to move back to the audience now and get some questions, if I can, please. We have a roving microphone, or microphones, one here. Just next to you, the gentleman there.
Oh, no. You go.
All right.
Right. Thank you. I'm just dismayed when I hear about the lack of planning for post-regime change, because, you know, we'd all seen it in Iraq. Thousands of millions of words have been written about the fact that there was no plan for afterwards. And how could it possibly be that it was a surprise that after the regime change it wasn't going to devolve into chaos when we'd actually seen this all happening in Iraq? We have seen this movie.
Stephen?
Either of you.
That's a really good question. I don't know, and it is really worrying that we went that there was this that we went in. It was backed heavily in Parliament. You know, that's why I reflect on the numbers. It was quite striking that when I was in Parliament when we were asked to back military action in Syria against Daesh, the Parliament having been asked 2 years before. And so as part of our committee's work, we produced a very, very short report. It wasn't produced by us, it was produced by some very capable officials who work with us. So I can't take credit, so I'll say it was a very good report done by them, which asked some very pertinent questions. And we said, and I'm less influential on the Prime Minister than my Conservative colleagues were, and the influence is, can you answer these very pertinent questions? And the government couldn't. So we stopped. That meant that no vote came before Parliament. 2 months later, David Cameron came back and said, I've answered your questions X, Y, Z. I didn't feel he had answered the questions other colleagues felt he had. But there is this feeling that that military action alone can solve these problems. Air power alone can solve these problems. I remember asking Philip Hammond about boots on the ground in Syria, and it hadn't really been properly thought through. One thing that I picked up from Mark's book was talking about, well, how do we stop making these mistakes in the future? And I was really interested to read some of your comments around how do we properly engage with civil society, because peace building cannot be imposed on a country. It has to be a little bit more organic. It's not terribly sexy. It takes a long time. And the analogy I always use is we're 25 years on, we're a quarter century on from the Bosnian conflict, but we're still spending money on capacity building. I think that's the kind of long-term strategy that you're looking at for these things, and that has to be before you're taking any kind of military action. Unfortunately, governments get sort of, 5 years is a long time in an election cycle. When you do get a 5-year election cycle, I know that even since we produced our report in 2015, the world has changed significantly. I had to reread the report and have a look at it, given all the other things that we've been filling our heads with. So I think that long-term commitment, which in any democracy is very, very difficult.
I mean, it's a good question. I don't want to be too hard on the FCO. The FCO has been hollowed out over the last 10 years. Yeah. And I saw what was happening in the FCO during that period, and they were dealing with an untold number of issues from Bahrain to across the Middle East. What was also happening, for example, in the Libya team, quite remarkably, from March to May, the entire Libya team and FCO were replaced. And they were replaced with younger officials, simply because this was part of the rotation, who knew nothing about what was happening on the ground. So one of the problems is that there is a lack of capacity. We have Ahmed Rashid here. I remember Jonathan Powell telling me, in fact, I think he told a Beyond Borders audience here in 2012, that when 9/11 happened and they rushed back from the TUC Congress, Blair and him, to number 10 to then plan their response, and he wanted to know something about Afghanistan, he could barely find anyone. He ran out to the bookshop and bought Ahmed Rashid's book on the Taliban, and he said by the next afternoon he was the go-to person. And the reality is that actually there was not a lot of knowledge ultimately about Libyan culture, the tribal system, how it related to eminent families in Tripoli. So there's a lack of knowledge, a lack of depth in the FCO, not enough deep policy thinking about things like political transition. And it is extraordinary that after Afghanistan and Iraq, we are not putting enough resources into this type of policy research analysis. And we've got to get it right next time round.
I want to squeeze in a few more questions, so if we could keep the replies brief, gentlemen. This lady here.
My name is Hannah. I'm from Libya, so forgive my passionate. Thank you, Mark, for the book. It really meant a lot to me to hear it from you and really showing what has been the first 8 months. I've been part of the Libyan revolution. I was one of its first faces, and with big dreams and idealism. And again, I'm sorry about my voice because it did shake me. Many people criticized the NATO and the humanitarian intervention, and as a revolutionary from the city, and Gaddafi was like 50 kilometers there, and we know the atrocities of Gaddafi's and what he did to us, especially the city of Benghazi for 42 years, and we have been always revolting against him. We always paid the prices, and we knew that if he entered Benghazi, there would have been a massacre and genocide there. So for us, we did call for the intervention, and it was the right thing from the people who were standing there on the ground. Now people, after after 7 years might criticize it. But as the people on the ground who were civilians, we had no agendas, no parties, nothing. We were only activists in the simplest form of activism. It was the right thing, and they did save our life. It went wrong later on, yes. However, and as Stephen said, there was many mistakes, and I'm not going to talk about the past and the mistakes. But my question to you, Stephen, you said that 1/3 of Libya is under the government of national accord. And I'm seeing there you might be repeating the same mistake. And this, again, I will say, I talk with myself, be careful here, because I think there is too many militia there. And I'm a civil state activist. I want a civil state. I don't want a religious state. I don't want a military state. However, if I have to choose between the only two, I will go for a military, despite the 42 years. Because the last thing I want is somebody to steal my resources, my freedom, my country, but also my religion. And he will steal our life and after death. So you have to be careful. I was following His Excellency Peter Millet and there and opening the embassy. But the question is really the government of national accord control 1/3 of the West, and you have to I know I
just want to put that question very briefly that you've asked to Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, look, first of all, I want to touch upon a point. Some of the finest FCO officials I've ever met were those working on Libya, including our ambassador to Libya, who's based in Tunisia, who's a phenomenal guy, does a dangerous and very, very difficult job with limited resources. But on that point, I mean, this is where we have to have a better understanding. I think I was more reflecting what the situation on the ground is at the moment so that we can understand it better. Now, the UK backs the government of national accord at the moment, but I think that we must always be thinking, how do we add value? Where can we, if the UK is going to invest in Libya, if the UK is going to try and fix the problems that it has created, and we have to take ownership, and I say we as all parliamentarians and as members of society here, we need to start thinking about long term, about how we do that. And I don't think we have the answers about how we do that at the moment. It's one of the reasons why Mark's book is so timely. So I'd like to see the Foreign Office have better resources so it understands its relationship with the government of national accord and other governments that exist as well.
If I might add, I'm sorry that I'm taking
just briefly,
longer.
please. Yes.
Yeah, so quickly. You have to, from my point of view, you have to understand you are not the only players. As I know that you know that.
Yeah.
Not only international players, and there's disagreement, there's the regional players. And when you want to own it, you have to really make sure that it's you there and at least, whatever. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got about 5 minutes, so time for a few more, please. Anybody?
We all know plenty of failed attempts at regime change. I wondered whether any of the panel could think of any successful examples of assisted regime change.
Well, I tell you one thing that we overlook, and it's interesting when we look even at the situation of Syria now and the devastation that's there. If we just recall what happened in Europe, Europe was in tatters at the end of the Second World War. Huge devastation, huge conflict. And how did we rebuild Europe? In the end, I think we rebuilt Europe by having sustained investment. The Americans came in and provided Marshall Plan assistance. But it didn't just invest, if you like, in state institutions and client states. It invested in society. And I think even if you look at what happened, for example, in the case of East Germany and West Germany, how was it possible to actually recover in the East? It was because of the massive commitment and investment that the German government made towards integration. And I think at the end of the day, we have to literally ask that question of ourselves. Are we willing to put in that patient, long-term approach and investment into, if you like, countries that border the Mediterranean for our own security, but also because we recognize, if you like, our own humanitarian and other obligations. So I think it's about also working with civil society. The one thing that this book says, and actually my experience of around the world, is that there are extraordinary individuals, organizations who need to be supported. And if the FCO doesn't have the resources, then why doesn't it tap into the kind of non-state actors on the ground? Hannah worked with the Centre for Humanitarian Dialogue, and in actual fact, then tried to set up a whole series of projects in Libya to try and get the buy-in of the Libyan people into a political transition process. They were unable to get funding from the FCO because it was taking 3 or 4 months. But actually, I think a more dynamic policy in which you actually engage non-state mediators, non-state civil society organizations in conflict transformation is one way in which we can help bridge the divide.
Thanks. Anyone else? This gentleman here. Maybe.
Tell me about the Russian role for other actors, concerned actors in this conflict. You seem to...
Stephen?
Sure. I mean, actually, it's a good point. It's a very good point that Hannah made, which is we don't. I mean, I've got to ask myself the questions that I can pose, and we should always be posing questions. The UK can't do this on its own. France can't do this on its own. And I think increasingly we need to think about what role for other actors. Now, what role for Russia, for Egypt? You know, with a big border and a big economy next door. And this is something that we need to think about how we need to interact. Now, engaging with Russia is difficult, extraordinarily difficult, because there has to be a willingness to work together on both sides. And also, to what extent is this, if you like, a European or Western imposed solution? So I think that the days of, say, the United States, Russia, Europe just deciding what's happened are gone, and this is why, include Russia and the others, but the point that Mark was making and about enabling civil society within a country, because peace efforts, and just touching on what was in the book that struck me, it seems if they're organic and they're sort of grassroots, have much more chance of being successful. But that doesn't happen over a 6-month period, over a year-long period. It happens over a 20, 30-year, or in European terms, we're still working on it 70 years on as well. We're talking about really long-term periods, which in politics are very, very difficult.
We're going to have to wrap up, but just before we do, towards the end of the book here, I'd like to ask you, Mark, you know, it's in the chapter entitled The Power of Cultural Diplomacy, and there's a little section here on Beyond Borders itself. I mean, the Libyan experience, the experience you've had, I mean, obviously Beyond Borders is in part a creation of come out of that. Can you comment a little bit more on that, and particularly Scotland's own position within this?
Well, I mean, I think Scotland is a small nation which shares, if you like, North European values about the efficacy of soft power and cultural diplomacy. I mean, it has an extraordinary set of institutions, from our cultural festivals, from our educational institutions, from a range of Scottish elder statesmen and women who have had the highest experience in multilateral diplomacy. So Beyond Borders is an attempt to try and generate, if you like, Scotland's place in the world, but the world in Scotland as well, partly through these festivals, but also by actually developing different types of programs. Here today we have a whole range of 1325 female peacemakers, not just simply from Syria and you heard from Libya and Iraq, but actually Sri Lanka, Afghanistan, Kashmir, India, and the list goes on. I have seen what Scotland can do in providing a platform, a safe, secure platform for people to come here to discuss their problems. As you know, at Beyond Borders, we've had the Turks and the Kurds discuss matters here. We've had the Bahrainis, both the opposition and the government here. We've had the Sri Lankans here. And I've seen what happens when you provide a safe, secure platform in a neutral environment, and I think Scotland can make a small but important contribution to trying to overcome misunderstanding between peoples, nations, and states.
Having just returned from Iraq in the last 2 days and watching what's going on there at the moment, I could not agree more. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark will be signing copies of his book immediately after we close here in this event, but it just leaves me to thank, obviously, Mark Muller, Stuart, Stephen Gethins, and yourself for attending, and please enjoy the rest of the festival. It's a fantastic. Thank you.